Yeah, I'll just say I'm really excited to be back part of the conference today, and this is a fresh sort of wave. This is based on my PhD study, and uh, different people here might have seen me present about my PhD work over the past few years. I've always been presenting aspects of the quantitative findings from the questionnaire, and today, for the first time ever, I am debuting some of the findings from the interviews, which are just endlessly fascinating. So I'll get right into it. I'm not going to explain to this group what out-of-field teaching is, but I have to show this slide because it has some of my favorite quotes about out-of-field teaching. One of those, of course, happens to be by Richard. An important problem because highly qualified teachers may actually become highly unqualified if they're assigned to teach subjects for which they have little training or education. I think I really value that perspective, and it's a thread certainly through my own work. So it's a mismatch of specialization. But then I come from within the sciences, a physicist myself, and I was a high school physics teacher. And just a reminder that specialized knowledge varies across the sciences. So this might be considered not necessarily out of field by certification, but out of field by specialization within that field of science. And I often show this example because to me, the torsion balance on the left there is something that I understand very well, the forces involved and what's going on. And the squishy thing on the right is something that I just don't know how to manage and don't know the parts of icky squishy bits in biology. That's just my perspective as a physicist. But having said that, that's because I didn't take any biology past age 16. I didn't take any biology in senior high school, and I didn't take any biology in university whatsoever. But then, of course, did my teacher education program and became considered a science teacher, able to teach sciences of all varieties. So the research questions that I'm going to focus today's talk around are really about teachers' experiences. So the context here is Canada, and I'm just trying to kind of scratch the surface and get at these initial ideas because the Canadian context hasn't been hasn't been studied very much in terms of out-of-field teaching. So thinking about really how does it happen in Canada? How does out-of-field teaching even happen from the perspectives and experiences of teachers? So to what extent did teachers expect that out-of-field teaching would be part of their careers before they entered the profession? In what ways do they begin teaching out of field? And how much agency do they feel that they have in decisions around their teaching assignments, which hits on a lot of the interesting parts of the discussion there from the presentation by the Ingersolls. So my theoretical framework in this study is social cognitive theory. And an interesting part that comes up in my analysis here is reciprocal determinism that is established by Bandura. That's the interaction between personal factors, things such as your emotions and beliefs, your behavior, and your environment. So the idea that those all affect each other. Your behaviors are not separate. Your behaviors have an impact on your beliefs, maybe about yourself, as well as your behaviors can have an impact on your environment, and your environment can impact your behaviors, and it all is interconnected. Social cognitive theory also places the individual and their ability to develop and act and change at the center of my study. And I take an agentic approach to out-of-field status, both in the design of my study. All of the data comes directly from teachers. It's not otherwise reported data because I want to give that agency back to teachers in a context of out-of-field teaching where, of course, they typically lack agency in what they're assigned to teach. Sorry. The context and methods here, so that's a map of Canada. And the methods I used were an online questionnaire and interviews that I conducted by video call. The methods were online because, as you can see, if you know Canada, the 4 provinces where I conducted this study are very large and spread apart. So thank goodness for online methods and the ability to do that. It's a mixed methods cross-sectional design with grades 9 to 12 teachers. So that's the final 4 years of high school. And the criteria for the questionnaire of the study was simply that teachers had to be teaching at least one math or science class at the grade 9 to 12 level in order to take part in the questionnaire. These were teachers who were teaching in the 2020-2021 school year and in those 4 Western provinces. And just an update to the group, I've marked on that map there where I live now. It's new to me. I have recently moved to Prince Edward Island, just so everyone can see where that is. So the questionnaire participants, which is not the part of the study that I'm going to focus on today, but it leads into how I got my interview participants. So I had 220 questionnaire participants, and they were quite a good demographic spread. So if you look on the right there at the pie charts, the total provincial populations, that's just total number of people by the Canadian census in each of those 4 provinces relative to each other, was actually mimicked very closely by my teacher participants in each province. So there are, if you look at the proportional representation of how many people are in BC versus the other provinces, about 43% of the people in the 4 Western provinces are in BC, and 44% of my questionnaire participants were in BC. So my study is not representative, or I don't claim it to be representative overall, but it does mimic the general demographic breakdown at the questionnaire level. But of course, today I'm going to be talking about the interviews. So more interestingly here, I interviewed 17 teacher participants, and this was done by purposive sampling from the questionnaire participants. I started with those who indicated that they were interested in a follow-up interview, and that was a lovely 113 of the 220 participants in the questionnaire indicated that they were interested in an interview, which I think was the first indication to me that this was something that teachers in Canada were interested in talking about and wanted a bit of more of a voice maybe in. So the purpose of sampling, I selected these participants based on that they were in fact teaching out of field, because of course the questionnaire had both people who were teaching out of field and in field only. So my first criteria was that I only wanted to interview people who had some aspect of teaching out of field. And then I selected to get a distribution across provinces, genders, subject areas across the maths and sciences, career stage, and I selected a bit for some interesting cases that were in there that I wanted to delve more into. I invited 30 teachers to interview with a goal of interviewing about 20, and I ended up conducting 17 interviews. You can see that there is a bit of an interesting gender distribution in the 17 people there. It's 11 men and 6 women. And so that's something I can talk about in the questions if people are interested. The data analysis for the interviews was done by an initial deductive coding just based on the selected topics, and then an inductive thematic analysis where I used my phenomenological approach. That included bracketing and horizontalization, and the thematic analysis included many sort of cyclical passes over the data, and then grouping of codes and grouping again. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the findings. So on research question 1 there, to what extent did teachers expect that out-of-field teaching would be part of their careers before they entered the profession? Here, I really found a dichotomy. Some expected it, and those who did expect it tended to expect it in a big way. So the first quote here, I had a realistic idea of it because I came from a rural school and I saw like my chem teachers teach my social studies classes, right? And I saw my music teacher teach my English class. So this person has an idea of that, that there being quite a big distance between the subject areas that people were teaching. The other one says, I never expected to teach what I was trained for. We had a professor at university when we were going through, and he always laughed, and he'd always ask you like, well, so what are all your teachables? And people would start and he'd say, it doesn't matter what they are. You'll never teach them anyways. So we always sort of had this idea that maybe you'd be fortunate enough to teach in your subject area, but maybe you wouldn't. But like, sure enough, I've never taught a biology class And that was talking to a mid-career teacher who'd been teaching for quite a significant amount of time. So the people who expected it often had a particular experience or person or reason that they were able to recall back to about, yes, I was aware of this because of. One of them was even, my mom was a teacher and she told me about this. And so she indicated that during my teacher education program, I should probably take some of these courses in order to be better prepared for out of field teaching. Um, but a lot of people did not. They did not expect it, and these people tended to be blindsided. So things like, I never expected having to teach an entire subject that I didn't know. I never imagined I'd teach a social studies course or that I would teach Planning 10. No, I hadn't expected that. I was just 21 when I graduated, and so I was still pretty naive, and I just thought, oh, I'll be a science teacher. I didn't realize. So that's a person who's conceptualizing within that bracket of science that feels okay, but that they didn't realize they'd be teaching beyond that. And similar here, no, I thought I was going to be a math teacher, and that was it. The second research question, in what ways do teachers begin teaching out of field? This one was very interesting in trying to code all of these responses and make sense of them. And it took a lot of rounds of kind of coding and grouping and rethinking over the responses. But ultimately, I've come up with 4 themes here. And these themes lie on 2 dimensions between choice. So what I asked them was really, the first time that you taught out of field, think back to that time. How did it happen? So this dimension of that they chose it or didn't choose it to what extent, and that they either knew before being hired or that it happened after they had been hired. So a reasonably common one, medium common, was that they applied for and took a position that they knew involved out of field teaching for them. So that is an element of choice. They chose to apply for a job that wasn't entirely within their wheelhouse. One participant said, when I was moving to the school, I knew I would be taking over the math and science job. I know that it's a small school, so I had to be open to teaching a variety of things. Some of them saw it as inevitable, but some of them felt like they actually had few options and little power, which moves that category sort of down within the dimension of whether or not they chose it, and makes it actually fairly similar to the personal circumstances or systemic constraints. So this is when people were limited by they didn't necessarily choose it, but they did realize it going into that job where it first happened. On the other side, the most common one was in the bottom right there, the shift in teaching assignment post-hire. So this is, they didn't choose it, and it happened after they were hired. A lot of these happened actually quite soon after they were hired, as in perhaps the school knew, but didn't say anything until the person had accepted the job. So one quote there, at my second job, because I could turn the computer on, I was actually hired to be an information processing and career life management teacher, which to that person, by the way, they were considering that to be in field or something they felt comfortable with. But by the first day, I was half information processing and half science, and that was out of field for them. My schedule had been made for a different teacher who last minute went back to another province. It already had elementary French in it, and that person was considered their infield to be science. So that was the most prevalent thing, was that it changed once they were already in a job, and they didn't necessarily choose it. Over in the top right, though, is kind of this ideal category of they did choose it and it happened after being hired. These ones often happened after a few years in a job. So teachers' own initiative, or they volunteered to teach out of field. Things like following a passion that they had. One person says, I pitched astronomy because I had an interest in it. I ran an astronomy club, then I turned it into a course. That's quite different as an experience of their first time teaching out of field. Sorry, I know that I'm running short on time, and I have actually a lot of findings, so I'm going to try and zoom through a bit. But the third research question here how much agency do teachers feel they have in decisions around their teaching assignments? Um, I've kind of structured my coding and my data for this into 5 categories of agency that I found, and this is based in teachers' experiences in Canada of how this works. I asked them, "Do you have any input when you're assigned what you're assigned to teach?" The most common categories were down the 2 lower ends, so limited or no agency, or what I've called consultative input. So where consultative input is where teachers are invited to share their preferences. A lot of teachers describe this as being like a questionnaire that was given out. What do you want to teach next year? Um, but teachers valued being asked on that, but a lack of transparency often led to feelings of limited agency. So the quote there, "We're given a survey, whether or not it's used in any considerations is unknown." Because there was no follow-up transparency, they felt that, like, yeah, maybe we were consulted, but did it actually inform anything that they were less sure about? Individual agency was where the teacher enacted sort of their own agency within an environment that was not necessarily fostering of that. So outside of whatever process the school undertook, the teacher was advocating for themselves or volunteering or using the idea of like, well, I'm flexible as a way to say in an environment where they didn't necessarily have the agency that I'm flexible. And so it kind of reclaimed some agency for them. And this is where that idea within Bandura's social cognitive theory of the interplay between environments and behaviors and personal characteristics comes back in. There's a lot of interplay here between environment and individual agency. So getting up towards the top end, negotiated decision making. This wasn't very common, but it did come up in a few cases where teachers were negotiating amongst themselves in small groups or departments, and then they would give these proposals to administrators, but principals and administrators still had the final decision, so could override whatever they had proposed. This was actually seen really positively. People felt like they had a say, they understood their colleagues' perspectives, and this led to greater feelings of ownership. So things like, well, I took that on because so and so couldn't. I understand that I was the best person amongst the options that we had. And so it was this sense of I'm choosing it because I'm pitching in because I know, yeah, I'm our best option amongst the people in my department. At the high end of collaborative agency there, I will note that this wasn't 100% exhibited by any of the experiences that the participants, there were glimpses in different aspects of it from different participants. So this would be administrators actively seeking out and honoring teachers' expertise and preferences, creating a strong sense of collaboration, professional agency, and respect, and that the decisions ultimately were collaborative and transparent, fully collaborative and transparent, rather than administrators sort of retaining a sense of that the final decision happened behind closed doors and rested with them. So the final bit of my findings here was just that after I had looked at each of those 3 topics or categories that I wanted to consider, there were some pieces, some codes that in my endeavor to horizontalize and not miss out any of the data, I was still kind of trying to piece together across those in an overarching way. And this led me to thinking about out of field teaching across the career span. And I know in a number of contexts, we often talk about or see that out of field teaching is more common in the early career for teachers. And that was something that certainly came up in these interviews. But what I thought was more interesting, and I never don't necessarily hear about this a lot in other contexts, was this idea that out of field teaching can be sticky. Once a teacher is taught out of field, a number of teachers came to this idea that it follows them. You can't get away from it. If you've taught out of field, they're going to reassign you to teach that thing. Even if you change schools, if it's on your resume, now people know that you've taught that you're willing to teach that. And it had this sort of creeping, sticky quality that you became entrenched in it. So I thought that was a really interesting sense of something, but I'm not sure how much. I'd be interested to hear if other people in their own context see that happening, or if that's a Canadian take on it. But also, if we think about, again, coming back to that school environment, the interplay between the school environment and teachers' own agency, that actually can impact out-of-field teachers' sort of the trajectory of out-of-field teaching within somebody's career. So there were a couple of cases that really stood out. One where the agency was quite constrained in their school environment, and the amount of, oh, thanks, Susan, the amount of imposed out-of-field teaching was high. So they started out doing a lot of out-of-field teaching, but it was quite top-down in how that was imposed. And that teachers then can enact their agency by sometimes changing schools, leaving that job. And I did have teachers who say, I was looking for a job and I knew I wasn't going to take it in a school where I wasn't only teaching this. I was looking only for a science teaching job. So they were enacting their agency in that sort of career move. And I considered that to be a decreasing trajectory of out-of-field teaching. So the amount or strength of out-of-field teaching went from sort of high to lower through them enacting that agency, because of the environment or forces within their experience. But in environments which foster high agency and have low burdens of imposed out-of-field teaching. So there was one person who was like, actually, the way that our teaching assignments are done is very collaborative, and I've never really had any out-of-field teaching. And that was the person who then, farther into their career was able to say, oh, actually, I'm suggesting and I'm proposing to take this on. I want to teach this thing. So that was an interesting case of an increasing trajectory of out-of-field teaching. They went from a low to high amount or strength of it, not necessarily high, but increasing, but taking it on in a good way. The teacher has the time and the effort to invest in it. They've already sort of honed elements of their pedagogy and teaching craft outside of just their subject specialism. And here, out-of-field teaching was seen to that person to be agentic in itself. And it was approached as contributing to their development and growth as a professional. So those were some overarching findings that came out of me trying to make sense of some pieces that were left over in the other research questions there. So in conclusion, how does out-of-field teaching happen in Canada? Do teachers are expected to be happening? Very yes and very no. A big dichotomy there of whether people know about it before they become a teacher. How did their first out-of-field teaching assignment happen? That was the 4 categories based on choice and timing of the dimensions. And then how much agency did they have? I found 5 levels of increasing agency, but most teachers described that they were within the bottom 2. My closing thoughts here are just that these are all preliminary ideas, so I don't have much yet. I'm looking to connect it to further discussions and literature, but my big thoughts are that out-of-field teaching leaves a mark. Talking to these teachers who had never, most of them, even if they expected to be teaching out of field, it was only once I asked them about that they understood what out-of-field teaching was. They hadn't really explicitly considered it as a concept within their career, as a phenomena. And so being in conversation with them and watching them live, digest and process and make sense of what that was within their career and the impact that it had was such a privilege, but also a responsibility to, start shaping how this conversation goes in Canada. And I could tell that for a lot of these teachers, yeah, even though it was the first time they were realizing it, out-of-field teacher had really left a mark on them and their development across their career. So my references, thanks so much for listening. I just want to thank in particular the funding that I've had throughout my PhD and my PhD supervisors who've been fundamental to my progress. And does anyone have any questions?